let's get to our PowerPoint. Okay, so this is where we stopped off, talking about evolution. So if I back up one slide, this is a slide we ended on, talking about DNA and bioinformatics and how related, in this example, we are to other primates. And you use bioinformatics to process and analyze that genetic information. Okay, a really important thing to remember, we've talked about units of different things. So in this case, populations are the unit of evolution. It's really important to keep in mind that evolution does not happen to the individual, it happens to the population over time. So what acts on individuals is natural selection. So getting that distinguishing little bit in there is important. Evolution is defined only in terms of change in population over time. Natural selection works on the individual. Evolution is changes in the population over time. So, as a definition, a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. Okay, members of a population are capable of meeting and mating. So, in this example that we're looking at here, birds, although one lives on an island, another lives on a different island, we would consider them the same population because they have the capacity to meet and breed. Fish, same story. If there are different parts of the same ocean, not too far away, they're still able to meet and interbreed. That would still be considered a population. Whereas squirrels in this example, they are terrestrial, they don't swim, at least not very much, and we would say that these squirrels that are separated and living on different islands are different populations because they cannot meet and interbreed. So, little funny thing, squirrels don't swim, or do they? They're not going to swim a long distance. It's not what squirrels typically do. Okay, so the members of population can carry different gene versions. So this is what we would call a gene pool. The gene pool is made up of all the versions of all the genes carried by all of the individuals in a population. So it's all of the genes that are in a population is the gene pool. Genetic variation arises when there is a mutation in the gene pool, and that leads to more variation. Sexual reproduction ensures that genes are randomly mixed. We've talked about that before, if you remember. Natural selection acts on the gene pool. Okay, I'm gonna close this really quick because I can't see my, oh, there we go. Sorry, just talking to myself. So traits that enhance survival and reproduction are going to be represented more in the gene pool than those that do not enhance survival and reproduction. So those that allow them to survive and reproduce are going to be expressed more often in that gene pool and become more common. So a generation to generation change in the gene pool we would call microevolution. And this is evolution on the smallest scale, on the genetic scale, perhaps due to a little mutation, a point mutation. So in this example, microevolution, we can see how when we're looking at the gene pool represented here, gene pool, and we have those alleles, you can, all the genes, sorry, for a particular trait that over many generations, that beneficial mutation that occurred increases in the gene pool over time, and it becomes expressed more often. So in this case, this is microevolution. So microevolution can result in a gradual adaptation of a species to its local environment based on which genes are expressed and allow better success. Success is in terms of survival and reproduction when we say success biologically. Okay, so fun question. Can you breed Chihuahuas? So if you started with a pack of wolves, how could you turn your wolves into a Chihuahua? And I didn't write this little part here of why would you want to, because I personally have a Chihuahua and he's a fantastic little dog. And I think they're awesome, awesome sauce. So how could you, because we know they're all related, all dogs are related to wolves. How do you go from a wolf to a Chihuahua? Any ideas, William? You are our only person today. Sorry, I'm going to pick on you. No?
I don't know.
And that is okay. Thank you for responding. I appreciate that. So we'll talk about how that
Okay.
can happen. So next slide, we'll talk about how that happens. So something to think about. Maybe I should make this our attendance question for the day. It doesn't mean you're right or wrong. Just wanting to see a thought process after we go through this chapter. Perhaps you will have a good answer. Okay, so extra thought question. Other than just body size, are there other traits that differentiate a Chihuahua from a wolf? I was going to hold mine up, but he's sleeping, so I'm going to be nice. So there's a lot of differences between a wolf and a Chihuahua. Size isn't the only thing. There's a lot of differences. Okay, so how is that related? We will talk about it. So changes to the genetic makeup of a population can happen in two main ways. The first is mutations, which we've already covered, and mutations are random, and these can create new genes. The other way you can get changes in a population is through sexual recombination. Pardon me. Okay, so through sexual recombination, in cell division, you have crossing over, where parts of one chromosome swaps places with the other chromosome from dad and chromosome from mom. And during this swapping, this shuffling of genes, you can create more variation. Okay, natural selection and fitness. What is fitness? So Darwinian fitness is essentially the contribution that an individual makes to a gene pool of the new generation compared to the contributions of others. So what we're saying is if there's an individual who is more fit, who had more offspring that were able to survive in their current environment compared to other organisms, those genes that were successful are going to become more prevalent in that population. So the fittest individual is going to survive. However, it doesn't mean it's always the strongest individual. And there are a lot of examples in nature where perhaps not the strongest individual wins, is successful in mating and reproduction and having offspring to survive to the next generation. There are many different types of adaptations that can improve fitness. One adaptation is camouflage. So can you see the little chicks there? We have one right here and another one right here. Camouflage is an adaptation that helps with survival. Often this is found in young that are still dependent on the parent or parents, and they need to blend into their environment to protect them from predators while their parent or parents are away from the nest or the den or the burrow. Okay, so some mechanisms of evolution. What can lead to change in a gene pool over successive generations? How do we change that gene pool? So we've already discussed one mechanism that can result in gene pool change. The main mechanism is natural selection. This leads to changes in the gene pool, and we would call this evolution when there is a change in the actual gene pool. Okay, so in addition to natural selection, there are other mechanisms that can contribute to evolution in the gene pool. And we'll go over each of these examples after this slide. Genetic drift, the bottleneck and founder effect, gene flow, and sexual selection. So in evolving population, there is usually a combination of all of these mechanisms that are happening at the same time. So genetic drift, this is a change in the gene pool due to chance. So the gene pool changes. How it changes was completely random, was due to chance, had nothing to do with whether or not an individual is more fit, for example, or not. This is why it's completely by chance. So for example, genes may be lost if a few individuals die or migrate, so leaving or entering a population at random. This happens or is really important in small or isolated populations. When it's small or isolated, any change can have a big effect. So this example here, we have beetles, 2 different sizes and 2 different colors of beetles. Random chance, 2 of them have been eliminated. That is going to change the gene pool, and that can lead to genetic drift. So now there's only 1 where there were 3 before. That affects the genes that are in the population. Natural selection is not a factor in genetic drift. This is random. It has nothing to do with fitness. Okay, bottleneck effect. So this happens when a population is dramatically reduced in size, and it usually happens in a fairly quick event or a catastrophic event. And when this happens, your gene pool is dramatically reduced. And so that changes the gene pool dramatically when you have a bottleneck effect where you only have a few individuals that are surviving, for example. They may not represent, their genes may not represent the entire population that was there. So it's been restricted. On the other hand, founder effect, this can happen when a few individuals migrate to a new habitat that is isolated. They still, again, may not be carrying all of the representative genes of their previous population. And so the new population that they found, because this is the founder effect, the new population is going to be genetically different, and it's not going to be, the gene pool is going to be different than the original population. So in either case, by chance, genes are lost from the gene pool. So an example of the bottleneck effect is cheetahs. In the 1800s, the population of cheetahs was dramatically reduced, and into the 1900s, we have continued to have major problems with the numbers of cheetahs. Their population was reduced so much that their gene pool is almost all the same. They have very little genetic variation anymore, which can be very dangerous and make them more susceptible to disease and birth defects and inability to reproduce. So this is why cheetahs are a subject of conservation concern, and there are breeding programs to help reintroduce cheetahs into the environment because we had lost so many. Okay. If you ever want to talk about conservation, I'm your person, especially if it's about California condors. Okay, gene flow tends to reduce the differences among gene populations. So gene flow. Most populations are not isolated. So you're able to have individuals travel from one population to another. This is an example of gene flow, or in this example here of butterflies being able to pass between two populations easily. And this allows genetic information to be exchanged between two populations because of migration, because of organisms moving from one population to another. Sexual selection can lead to changes in the gene pool. Sexual selection, I could spend days talking about this subject. It's so fascinating, especially in birds. They have so many interesting behaviors and adaptations directly due to sexual selection. So it is a form of natural selection that depends on an individual's ability to get a mate. And it's often based off of an individual's preference for a particular mate. And that can be based off of appearance, song, health, parasite load. All of these can come into play with sexual selection. So, for example, females may choose mates for their traits. This is a bird of paradise. I believe you find them in Indonesia, and they have elaborate feathers, and they do these amazing displays. And it's the combination of their feathers and their display that attracts a female. And females will sit there and watch a male display, and then they'll inspect the male and decide, is this somebody that I want to mate with, that I want to father my offspring? And females can be very choosy and reject a mate. Doesn't like how they look or how their display was or how their call was or some other reason. And it's all based off of that mate preference. Another example, males will compete with each other for access to mates. So down here we have elephant seals competing and fighting for access to mates. And those fights can be very gruesome and not pretty. Okay, survival of the prettiest. So while working on his theory of natural selection, Darwin was troubled by peacocks. A long tail makes peacocks vulnerable to predators. So why do they have it? Because that does not make them more fit. If they have they have basically a handicap that makes it more likely that they'll be captured by a predator. Why do they have this big elaborate tail? Any ideas, William?
Is this for looks?
It's for looks. It's for sexual selection. Very good. And so there is a trade-off between sexual selection and the handicaps that come with having an elaborate plumage, for example, that makes it easier to be captured by a predator. So there's definitely a trade-off. If they grew even bigger, the handicap would be larger. So there's a limit to how elaborate a display or feathers can be, because then it becomes a handicap. So there's definitely a trade-off there. So it's about looks, it's about female preference in this case, and females prefer males with big, beautiful, elaborate, healthy feathers. Okay, macroevolution. This looks at changes, sorry, I'm checking the time. We're doing good. Okay, so this looks at changes throughout the history of life. Macroevolution is change on a large scale. Speciation is when you form new species. This still happens. It's a slow process, but speciation still occurs, and we have seen it happen. So our diversity on Earth represents a long history of evolution, as we know that ancestral species gave rise to one or more new species. And so we'll look at some examples of this and how we are able to kind of track the relationships in ancestral species to what we have today. So speciation can occur in different mechanisms, two main mechanisms. Non-branching evolution, this is where an ancestral population changes gradually over time to a new species. So this is a single lineage, a single population, slowly changing over time. In branching evolution, an ancestral population will split into two or more populations. So there's different lineages, and the relationships are different. So we have our ancestral species here, and at some point in time, it split into two new populations that created two new species, and they continued to change over time to the modern species that we see today. Okay, novel features can incite large-scale evolution, and novel features have evolved over time throughout history. So one of the examples of novel features is the evolution of feathers and the evolution of flight in birds. And this shows how structures that serve one role can gradually change to serve a different role over time. Early birds or dinosaurs that had feathers we believe, were not able to fly. They didn't have enough that seems to support flight. They might have been able to glide. They may have been used for support when you're propped against a tree, for example. Those feathers, those adaptations changed over time to allow something like flight. Okay. In mass extinctions, the majority of living species will suddenly die out. There are 5 documented mass extinctions that we know of. The most recent right here was 65 million years ago, and this is when the large dinosaurs went extinct. Question that people are discussing: are we entering the 6th great extinction? Because we are experiencing global warming. Global warming is usually followed by an ice age. And if that does actually occur, we could be entering into our sixth great extinction. We don't know if that's truly happening, but it is hypothesized. Okay, rapid species diversification. I can't talk today, I apologize. Rapid species diversification follows mass extinctions. So following a mass extinction, in this example where the dinosaurs went extinct, mammals diversified greatly. So if we look at our ancestral mammal species and then looked at the diversification that happened afterwards, we have bats and bears and dolphins and bisons and elephants and humans, all sorts of different organisms that all came from a common mammal ancestor. And that happened after that last extinction where the dinosaurs went extinct. Okay, and geological records tie the history of Earth and life together. So geology is important when we talk about evolution. So in geology, there are 4 broad periods in the history of Earth, and each of those periods are marked by the appearance of distinctive life. And each era represents a distinct period in that life. So if we look here, this shows a time scale from when we believe Earth was formed all the way to present day here. There are 4 major periods. We have the Precambrian, which is the majority of the time period. And the last 3 happen relatively close to present day. That would include the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic periods. So in the Precambrian period, which is the oldest period, this is when we believe that Earth formed, prokaryotes came to be, and this is where we have the oldest known prokaryotic fossils. And then even later in time, not later, but later in the Precambrian period, where closer to now, is when the first eukaryotic fossils appeared. I am not going to ask you questions on exact years, dates. You would need to know the time, Precambrian, Cambrian, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, and perhaps what happened in those time periods, but you don't need to know the dates. Okay, so in Paleozoic era, this is when there's a lot of diversity exploding in the oceans. And you also see plant life beginning on land and animals starting to migrate from water to land. And this is where there is a mass extinction event. Then we move to the Mesozoic era, and this is when dinosaurs first appeared. And flowering plants began to appear and dominate the landscape as well. These, if you're noticing, there is an increasing trend for complexity as we are moving through these periods. And then lastly, the Cenozoic. This is when dinosaurs went extinct and mammals diversified to where we have today. And the shortest time period ago, 200,000 years ago, is postulated, is when humans that look like humans first appeared. Okay, so Earth geology does have a pretty big impact on the history of life. And so we'll talk a little bit about geology. The Earth crust is made up of tectonic plates, and these tectonic plates are floating on top of the hot rock mantle of the Earth. And these tectonic plates do move, and that can, when they move or they rub against each other, that can cause earthquakes and volcanoes, for example. But we also know that a lot of these plates, or the continents, are still slowly moving apart from each other, even now. So these plate movements continually rearrange the geography of continents. So if we go back in time, originally we had one large continent essentially that was called Pangaea. And due to these tectonic plates and their constant movement, which is slow, those Pangaea was broken up into smaller continents, which then spread apart across the globe to their positions now. And yes, they are still moving, but very slowly, like a centimeter a year. So it's very tiny. Okay. So geological upheavals can be catastrophic in the short term and alter the evolution of life. So examples of catastrophic occurrences would be earthquakes and volcanoes, like I mentioned. This picture here is showing the San Andreas Fault, and that is found in Southern California. The previous community college that I taught at in Southern California had the fault line run right through the middle of campus, which was a little intimidating because there were multiple earthquakes while I was teaching, and we were on the fault line, and so it was a little disconcerting. But when you have those two tectonic plates rub against each other, that's what's causing an earthquake, and it can lead to very big destruction. Volcanoes, on the other hand, yes, rubbing together or plates pushing into each other can cause volcanoes to occur, which can lead to also mass extinctions and building mountains. Okay. Oh, in this picture down here of the globe, the black lines represent the tectonic plates. So there are different plates in different regions. Okay, so changes in Earth's geology over time has been intertwined with the history of life on Earth. Okay, switching gears. Okay, imagine if you were visiting a zoo and in the cat exhibit you saw lions from Africa and tigers from Asia. We consider lions and tigers different species. Sorry to ask you, William, but why would we consider them different species?
They have different features.
They have different features, right? Would they naturally interbreed in the wild, or would we even find them in the same place in the wild? What do you think?
Not in the same place, probably in the wild.
Very good. Yeah, you're not going to find them typically in the same place. And because they do have different features and behaviors, they're not naturally going to breed, even if they did come across each other in the wild. But we are able to get them to breed in captivity. And the hybrid between a lion and a tiger is called a liger. Would we consider ligers to be a species? What do you think?
I don't know, maybe?
Okay, and that's okay to not know. It's a hybrid. Typically, we don't consider hybrids to be new species, most often because hybrids are often sterile, and so they're not able to reproduce. And because they don't reproduce or found in the same populations in the wild, we would not consider them to be a new species. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I really appreciate you talking. I know I'm picking on you today. Okay. So, talk more about what is a species here. So, the word species comes from the Latin word that refers to appearance. And so, up until recently in the history of biology, we use the appearance of an organism to distinguish it from as one species, distinguish a species from another based on appearance, on its morphology. However, we now know that appearance alone cannot be used to tell a species apart from another. There's more going on than just appearance, and sometimes we have species that look the same that are actually different species. One of those examples would be right here, the difference between eastern and western meadowlarks. They look exactly the same, but they're found in different locations geographically, and they also have different behaviors and songs. And in birds, song is really important. It is one of the ways they distinguish each other and know that they're the same species, is if they have the same call. So that's really important. Over here in this picture, we have a bunch of different varieties of dogs. They are all the same species. They look different, they're different breeds, but they're still all dogs. Okay, so what is a species? The most often used definition is that a species is a population that is able to interbreed and produce healthy, viable offspring, viable or fertile offspring. This definition is looking at interbreeding, but it does not work for all species because not all species interbreed. For example, bacteria reproduce asexually. They bud off from each other. And for extinct organisms, we don't know if they were capable of mating or not. So we can't use our traditional definition of species for some examples. So for some organisms, we have to use appearance, and others, we have to use different means to distinguish species. So for species that we can define as a group of individuals that are able to successfully interbreed, what's keeping them separate? Usually there's one or more reproductive barriers that prevent individuals that are from different species from interbreeding. These reproductive barriers are pretty important. So I already told you two of the reproductive barriers for the eastern and western meadowlark. They live in different locations. They have different behaviors and different calls, different songs. And all of those are, well, the different calls, the different behaviors are reproductive barriers that prevents them from interbreeding, even if you did find them in the same place. Okay, some examples of reproductive barriers. Behavioral isolation. This is where members of a species often will identify each other through specific rituals, behaviors, or calls. If they do not successfully have those behaviors or calls or rituals, they're not recognized as being the same species. Organisms will often mate at different times, and if they are not ready to mate and other organisms are mating, that prevents them from interbreeding. So there are very specific time frames for organisms when they are able to mate and when they don't mate, and that isolates them from other species. Another type of isolation or reproductive barrier is habitat isolation. And this is where if a species lives in a different habitat, they may never meet. One lives in a dry desert, for example, and another one lives in a lush meadow. They live in different habitats. The likelihood that they would meet is very low. Okay, more reproductive barriers. Mechanical incompatibility. This is where you have members from different species that are not able to mate because their anatomy is incompatible. Their anatomy is kind of a lock and key fit, and it has to be a very specific anatomical shape, and if it doesn't match, they cannot breed. Another type of reproductive barrier is gamete incompatibility. This is where the gametes, the sperm and eggs of an organism, can't fertilize each other if they're from different organisms. And this is often found in bodies of water. For example, corals, they release their eggs and sperm into all at the same time into the water. And then we hope that the egg and sperm randomly meet and fertilize into a zygote. But if you have egg from coral A and sperm from coral B, they will not be able to match up. And so that's gamete incompatibility, and it prevents crossing from organisms. So it's a reproductive barrier. And lastly, hybrid weakness. This is where you have offspring from two different species may be considered unfit. Often they are sterile, or they may have some sort of detriment. And so they are not considered to be fit and are not likely to breed. So how do we get a new species? Speciation occurs when one ancestral species evolves into one or more new species. Usually there is an event that separates a population. So it could be time, space, or genetics. Populations then are going to diverge, come together. No, diverge is going apart, sorry. They're going to diverge along their own evolutionary path. So in this very simple drawing here, we have the original population, where in some point there is a divergence and splits into two new species from the original population. And this is all over time. It does not just happen like that. Okay, Based on the gradual model, species acquire small adaptations over a very long period of time. So in this example here, we have ancestral species of modern horse, and the changes that occurred were very slow over time. In a different model called the punctuated equilibrium model, this hypothesizes there were periods of stasis where nothing happened, and then there were occasional bursts of speciation where it happened really quickly in time. So one example of what we would consider punctuated equilibrium was during the Cambrian period. We called it the Cambrian explosion. This is where the rate of evolution was much higher than the normal rate. But it still took millions of years, but over time it was considered a short period of time. Okay, allopatric speciation occurs when there is a physical barrier that isolates populations. So in this example, the Grand Canyon separated two species of squirrel, and over time, those, not two species, separated two populations of squirrels. And over time, those squirrel populations developed new changes and became separate species because they were geographically isolated from each other. Sympatric speciation, this occurs when there is not geographic isolation. An example of when this happened was between two different wheat species, emmer wheat and wild wheat. About 8,000 years ago, these two wheat species interbred and created a sterile hybrid. Typically, when we get a sterile hybrid, we think that it's not going to be able to reproduce. But the sterile hybrid is able to reproduce asexually, self-fertilization, and was the basis of modern wheat that we have today. So speciation in plants can occur suddenly due to a large-scale genetic change where there is no physical barrier. And so this is an example where it occurred rather quickly without a physical barrier, and you're able to create a new species. Taxonomy. Taxonomy is how we identify, name, and classify species. All life is classified into one of three groups that we call domains, and this is based on cell type. So, hierarchy. So where does a tiger fit into taxonomic hierarchy? When we start with domain, every organism can be placed in a hierarchy, which is an ordered series of progressively smaller categories, more and more inclusive. And the hierarchy ends when we reach to the species name. So here we have an example. So if we start up here, the very top, with eukaryotes or eukarya, that is a domain name, one of the domains. Note that in eukarya, there's a wide variety of organisms, including plants, insects, snakes, cats, all sorts of organisms, okay? But as we continue to move through the hierarchy levels, the groups become more and more inclusive, and they become more similar as we continue towards the bottom. So for example, in this group here, carnivores, all of the organisms are meat eaters. If we go down one more, all organisms are in, let's see, is that family? The family Felidae. And then genus is here, Panthera, and then species, if I can write. So I do want you to know the organization of taxonomic hierarchy. So I'm going to finish writing those out right now and give you a mnemonic to help remember. So here is the kingdom, phylum, class, and then order. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And a mnemonic that I learned in college was, so if we take K, P, C, O, F, G, S. K, so K for kings, play chess on fine grained sand. That was just the mnemonic that I learned, and I still remember it today. Actually, I know what I'm going to do for attendance today. I want you to come up with your own mnemonic for the taxonomic hierarchy from kingdom to species. And I'll write that up in the assignment section. Oh, there it is. I forgot that I wrote that down. Sorry. So there we have our order from domain all the way to species. I don't need you to put domain in your homework or your attendance today. We're just going to focus on the ones that I brought up, okay? So enter the question again, where does a tiger fit in the taxonomic hierarchy? We identify species using the last two groups in the hierarchy, the genus and the species. And we put those two words together, and that's a scientific name for that organism. So for tigers, their scientific name is Panthera tigris, and no other organism has that same name, only tigers. And that's how we identify them using our taxonomy. Okay, let me double check our time, make sure we're doing good. We're doing good. Okay. Evolutionary relationships can be represented by phylogenetic trees. And these represent the evolutionary history of an organism. Phylogenetic trees are basically a hypothesis of how organisms are related to each other. So if we look here, we have our ancestral species. And over time, there have been branches, and the population has diverged and formed new populations. Then we're also able to make inferences based off of these phylogenetic trees and determine the relatedness of organisms. So in this example, species A and B are more closely related to each other than they are to C, because C diverged off at a longer period of time, and is less closely related. So we can use what's called clades that represent a branch in the tree of life. So a clade is any group of species that is made up of ancestor species and it has all of its descendants. So in this example, we have a clade. And oh, by the way, the analysis of clades is called cladistics. And you are able to take a group of organisms, and they're grouped based, in this example, based on what type of egg they have. Amniotic egg, all the organisms that have amniotic eggs would branch off of here. And so this is just showing a wide variety of relationships. So when we look at the snake, lizard, and bird, who would you say is most closely related to the bird?
So I would say the lizard.
You're right, absolutely. Yeah, because they branched off more recently and are coming from the same common ancestor. So they would be considered more closely related. So you were right. So you just have to look at where the branches happen, and that will help you kind of determine relatedness. Okay, so reading phylogenetic trees can give us insights into the relatedness. So the tips of the tree up here represents groups that are most recently evolved. And to determine how closely related two species are, we look at where their most common ancestor is. So you did that absolutely right, William. So in this example here, species A and B, their most recent common ancestor is right here. So they are more closely related to each other than, say, A and C, because A and C, their most recent common ancestor is way back here in time. Okay, question. In this example here, which species is most closely related to our polar bear? Looking at our phylogenetic tree, who is most closely related to the polar bear?
Yes, that would be the brown bear.
You got it. That's right, the brown bear. They share a common ancestor right here. So they would be the brown bear. Very good. And that is all for our lecture. Let me stop our screen sharing here. Do you have any questions about today, William?
No, I am good.
You are good. Awesome. All right. Well, I will let you go for today. And let's see, your next quiz. Let's just pull that up real quick so we are up to date on everything. Today is June 17, and I'm looking at the syllabus right now. So the next quiz is not until June 22. So there is some time. I believe I'll double check and see if I can let you guys take it anytime during this unit. So if you want to take it sooner, you can. I will double check on that right after I'm done talking with you, okay?
Okay, yes.
All right. All right, guys. Look for your attendance on Canvas, and I will talk to you next week. We do not have any more Zooms this week. All right. Have a good day.